two words that come up a lot in regard to civilization games, and not just Civ 7, are ahistorical and anachronism. Well, the first word is associated with people who have no sense of or interest in history. It's a worldview represented by somebody like Henry Ford, who said that history is bunk. To apply this way of seeing the past to Civ games is an overshoot. Sure, it's a matter of opinion, and I'm sure there are people out there who know more about specific periods of history than anyone on the Firaxis staff, but I don't think anyone can accuse the staff of being uninterested in or ignorant of history. The second word, though, is part of every Civ game's bones. Anachronisms are when things pop up in an historical movie, TV show, novel, or game that should not be there according to the historical record as it's currently known. This does not include flights of fancy where someone has written a narrative that could have happened, but which we have no record for. For example, we know that Genghis Khan, some years before his death, summoned a Taoist master to him. It was a year-long journey, and we have a written record of that trip. But we have no record of what happened once the master arrived and before he was eventually sent packing. So I wrote a play set in that brief period of time we have no record for. That's not ahistorical or anachronistic, although I certainly might have introduced some unintentional anachronisms in the play. Meanwhile, civilization games are riddled with anachronisms of different kinds. For example, playing as one leader in Civ throughout time is a problem because no leader or civilization lasts that long. And in Civ 7, matching leaders with unrelated civs is part of the game, and that is obviously anachronistic as well. You can conquer the world in Civ 1, which no one has ever done, or you can develop giant killer robots in the 1700s. If you're a good enough player in some of these games, you can have chariots facing off against tanks. The recent Firaxis workshop introduced the concept of syncretism, being able to choose a strong unit or improvement from the same period as the Civ you were using. It feels like cheating, but only at history. If it's part of the game, then it isn't cheating in game terms. This is all the result of developers trying to make something that is based in history, but is still a game. And the people who play the games want the feeling of immersion in a grand narrative, but the gameplay has to be interesting too. This combination of interests has led to many arguments about what the best recipe is for a strong history-based game. And that's what they are, is recipes. Taking a lot of the same basic ingredients and adding and subtracting to get something that as many people as possible will want a taste of. I think Civ 7's acknowledgement of how civs rise and fall and fade might make it the most historically accurate Civ game, while being able to strap in any leader with any Civ makes it the least historically accurate game at the same time. But is accuracy everything? Postmodern historians would argue that the so-called grand narratives are fictions, that history is subjective, and that it is constructed over time. Napoleon said that history is a set of lies agreed upon. Maybe he was a postmodernist ahead of his time. More likely, he was hinting that people who write the history often were not present at the events they wrote about. And history doesn't just settle down once it passes. We keep learning new things that change our views of the past. Historians themselves have changed their tunes over the ages in terms of deciding what led to the fall of Rome. New archaeological sites emerge, for one thing, and new stories re-emerge. I'd never heard of the Tulsa Massacre until I read about it in a Cracked.com article, and then a few years after that, I saw the massacre depicted in the first episode of The Watchmen. We turn to history for certainty, but it has a nasty habit of shifting under our feet. And just as importantly, not every historian sees the same things exactly the same as the next historian. I remember one American history course I took where we had to complete 6 history book reviews over the course of the year. And I fell behind in the second term and asked if I could write one triple review about the Mexican-American War. So read 3 books, but just write one essay comparing and contrasting them. I thought I was taking the easy way out. He approved my madness, and I sat down and read 3 books about a war I had never studied in high school or earlier. I was in Canada at the time, right? The material was not scintillating, I got to tell you, but some common themes emerged from all of it. Don't ask me to tell you what they were, because that was 45 years ago and it didn't stick. But what did stick was 2 things. The styles of the writers were dramatically different and made for very different reads. And the 3 historians emphasized slightly different things. One leaned at least into, let's say, the America the Great version, as opposed to the other 2. There was general agreement that the war was the result of the manifest destiny doctrine, and that President Polk was overreaching, but the characterizations of him were each different. I think I preferred the historian who relied on a more dramatic narrative, trying to put you in the moment at various points, even though that's not very objective. So after 130-some years to think about it, historians did find some consensus on that war, but it wasn't complete by any means. Now, that didn't turn me into a postmodernist tearing down the grand narratives and seeing history as a purely subjective and constructed thing. But at the same time, I was discovering anarchist political philosophy, and it was aiming me at doing some of the same things as the postmodernists, except in a more class-oriented way. I still respect facts, but as with a ping-pong ball, you can see players bat facts back and forth until they accumulate enough spin and counterspin that someone is going to get fooled eventually and lose the point. And yes, that's a metaphor. It can be fun watching the game, at least to some extent. But it can be very disillusioning to look at the present. Historians have the excuse and luxury and benefit of not being in the middle of the fray. But what about us when we're right here, right now, and we can't agree on what we're seeing, even on videotape out of Minneapolis? Sure, we don't have access to all the facts, but we diverge spectacularly on what did or didn't happen. So is Henry Ford right? If we can't agree on the present, maybe we shouldn't even care about the past. Judging by the strong opinions about what is historical and what is not in regard to Civ 7, I think Ford is dead wrong. The very disagreement that players have about the game is proof that he's wrong. I think the main debate that I've already alluded to at the start is over the tension between history and game. I mean, what you've been watching while I discuss this is a playthrough of Xerxes, King of Kings and Tonga. I chose this combo because it makes no sense in terms of historical accuracy, and to be honest, not much sense in terms of having a successful game, but I'm sure someone will prove me wrong about the game part. If we wanted a game that was more loyal to history, a history that is a loose or strong consensus depending on the subject, we would have a great Tongan leader, which Google tells me there have been plenty of. Or Xerxes would be leading the Persians, which, in fact, you can have him do. A more realistic game would have your leader die sooner, as he must do while establishing a dynasty in Crusader Kings 3, for example. And that game is a good example of something a little bit more historical in some ways, at least the overarching spirit of the times, as in Old World. But you can't build a beginning-to-end game about history without sacrificing some accuracy. And sometimes more accuracy means more complexity, which is partly why I haven't finished a game of Crusader Kings yet. And I've already talked about the who is a real leader debate in another video. It almost has nothing to do with history, but is more about traditional historical narratives versus less traditional approaches. Everyone talks about Harriet Tubman, but for me, the hardest one to swallow was Confucius. Not because he wasn't significant in terms of offering practical leadership about proper governance, but because he was philosophically too different from me. I'm more of a Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching guy, but he's not a good fit for two reasons. His philosophy of giving into the natural flow of things runs somewhat counter to the idea of building the empire of your dreams. And, well, he might not have actually existed. So I concede the point to Confucius for now. The game needs things to be historically tied, is the thing, but not historically bound. And you can see this in the very first Civ game. The leaders were figureheads meant to put a face to the math. The civs were identical. Later on, we got the distinct buildings and units, the civs and leaders with differing characteristics, the more asynchronous approach. But I didn't care about these things from the start. It was just terrific to play a game that nodded to history at least, and that was fun to play. And the same has been true for me with every Civ game since. I want the history, and I want the fun. It's just that you have to remember that virginal history was being sacrificed to the volcano of the game to keep things going smoothly. You can see the attempt to be even more historically accurate in Civ 6, with the development of alternate versions of some of the leaders, representing their very different sides and abilities. This is continued with Civ 7, but, it's not just an attempt to be historically accurate. It's an attempt to introduce new play possibilities by using basic character models they already have at hand. I'll confess that I've taken full advantage of the mix and match approach to history because I like the game possibilities at times more than the historical accuracy. But then I grew up on Peabody and Sherman cartoons where the historical was turned on its head just for the sake of the hysterical. I wouldn't have watched it if it wasn't for the historical parts, though. I actually learned little bits and pieces of history from those cartoons. Nothing I could pass a test with, but enough to keep me interested in coming back for more. Anyway, I like putting unlikely pairings together, and my unhinged combos videos are a reflection of that. And sometimes you learn something, even by accident. A few weeks ago, I decided to go for a culture win with Napoleon Revolutionary and put him in Egypt for the wonder-building abilities, right? But you say, Napoleon really was in Egypt, just thousands of years later. So that was a nice bit of historical irony, and also a pretty decent game, I have to tell you. I think for some people, history can be fun only in proportion to how much we stick to the facts. And I can relate to that, but I can also find fun by not sticking to the facts. So I do both. The other truth behind history in games is that, and I know this is obvious to a lot of you, history would not be fun if you were to meet your leaders from the game. You know what they say about it being a good idea to never meet your idols? Well, consider meeting up with Xerxes or Genghis Khan or Napoleon. They would not live up to your fantasy. The only reason we can have them in games as playthings is because of the distance time has put between them and us. We can look at them in terms of their strategy and accomplishments, not at who they were as people. We only want them as playthings, and that means they have to be reduced to abilities and tendencies. I mean, Stalin has made appearances in the game for the sake of historical accuracy. But for reasons we all understand, Hitler, Mussolini, and others might not make the cut. Nor should Stalin, really, at least not now. They're still too close to us. Give it a couple hundred years and Civ 42 will have them for sure, because they will be just game material then. The past is always going to be at least partly a horror show, and that is not going to fit neatly into a game. All sides in this debate know these things inherently, but there is this line between historical simulation and historical gamification that some players say we must not cross. But can we actually agree on where that line is? I mean, some fans who have rejected Civ 7 have done so for a mix of both game reasons and history reasons. This is because historical and game elements are bound inextricably with each other in Civ 7. And for me, that's a sign of a decent game. Hopefully the upcoming changes in the game will help make it feel more historical to the players who've been disillusioned by the number of changes to the Civ model. And the players who've enjoyed the very new take on the game will be able to keep trying new things out. Look, I do love history, but there's never been anything or person I have loved that I haven't questioned. I've got this Socrates in a philosophical hamster wheel that never stops turning. History is no exception. I do not accept it as it is given to me. And I can understand people who feel the same way about this game. The questioning is good, and we all share that at least. This is the part where I'm supposed to say, hit the like and hit the subscribe, yada, yada, yada. So now I have. I'm Civilized Raccoon, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but I also have an epilogue to this video. I made a shocking discovery while making this. Xerxes and Tonga do not suck as a pairing. If they befriend independent powers and ignore making a lot of deals and wasting their influence on other leaders and civs, they can use the city-state bonuses and Tonga's trade-generating civic to bring in a lot of extra gold, etc., and power Xerxes' military machine. And Tonga's extreme scouting abilities set the stage for a long-term conquest game. Just because they seem like innocent trader types does not mean they disapprove of war. I figure if those two can work together, maybe there's hope for... Nah, let's not get carried away. I'll see you in the next one.